I think as society, we want the easy pill, right? We don't want to go do the hard work. And so I think, that's one of the things that's a downside to this. Once you're on it, in a lot of cases, they're saying you're on it for a long time, maybe the rest of your life, because if you get off of it and you don't change your behavior, you're going to gain that weight back.
Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Todd, great to have you on the show.
Dan, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get into things, would you mind telling everybody who you are and what you're up to and so on?
Yeah, so I'm probably not your normal guest. I'm a software guy. Excuse me, I've spent the last 35 years in mostly B2B software. Mostly an entrepreneur. Had a good stint at a company that sold for $8.3 billion. And today I basically run a software startup school. People come to us with a software idea, and we have a 6-month program where we help them do customer discovery, do the build process, and then build a go-to-market strategy. And then if they need revenue or if they need capital, we can help them kind of align with that. So it's really been kind of an economic development area where we're trying to create more jobs, retain more of our youth from our universities instead of having them leave the state.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's probably less daylight between our audiences than it might seem, because there's lots of agencies building software products as skunkworks.
Awesome.
Sometimes they get off the ground, sometimes they collect dust, but perhaps we'll get into that if we have time. So
sure.
But anyway, I found you through a lovely environment called Substack, which is chaotic and changing every single day, but overall I have a lot of fun there. And it was on the topic of GLP-1s. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, for those that don't know, just explaining, like, people are 5, what are GLP-1s and how did you come to get interested in them?
Yeah, so I write a Substack that Dan's referring to, and it's mostly on startup stuff. And so basically every week I write up on the startup themes, and mostly it's about how to go from zero to kind of having your first product and revenue. But one weekend I started kind of stumbling on this GLP stuff, and I had a couple friends that basically were overweight and had some diabetes, and they were talking about it. And I was like, I'm just going to start to research this. I know very little about it. I went in this kind of total rabbit hole for an entire weekend. My wife was pissed at me going, like, what are you doing? Like, you're not paying attention. And so, but I was like, just kind of like going, there's so much stuff here. And I was amazed at maybe the repercussions that this could have. It's not a very expensive drug to manufacture. The drug makers are making it pretty expensive, and so there's good margin in it. But I was really trying to understand kind of like the impact to it. And so I wrote an article that basically kind of took off on Substack and got some play. But it really wasn't an area that I normally kind of focus on. I'm not a doctor. I did talk to some doctors about it to research on kind of what we were doing. But it was mostly just kind of a passion project to learn something new and then understand kind of all the repercussions that this could have in our society. And I was kind of, bombastic a little bit about, everybody talking about AI, but this is something that I think lots of people will take advantage of. And the repercussions to our society, I think, are going to be written over the next decade or two of just changes in behavior.
Yeah, for sure. And just for those that don't know the word GLP-1, because I actually find that's common a lot of the times in the agency space, is like it's Ozempic, it's these drugs that are regulating impulse control for the purpose of weight loss. So with the disclaimer that neither of us are doctors and we'll get to the business stuff soon, can you talk a little bit about what you've learned in terms of how these drugs work?
Yeah, really, it's a drug that actually impacts kind of your brain, right? And it really kind of gets you to think you're full. And so it's basically a rewiring of kind of how you think in the processes in your brain. So it's kind of interesting in how it's doing it. I don't think they exactly know exactly how it happens. They just know in trials that's exactly what it does. And so then people feel full. They feel full sooner. And they don't want to eat as much. And in some cases, there's been some side effects where, they just feel nauseated. They don't feel very good. And then basically Mounjaro is one of those that I think early on had that. And I think as they've done subsequent versions of it, they've been able to kind of deal with some of the side effects around it. But it basically is a drug that goes directly to the brain and sends the signal that you're not really that hungry anymore.
Yeah. And if getting into, what it means for us as business owners, agency owners, et cetera, you used a great phrase in the article, which is this could represent our air conditioner moment. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the air conditioner moment came from this idea that, in the South, people didn't want to work in offices at all because it was just too freaking hot. And so when you got an air conditioner, the productivity of places that were hot went just off the scale. And so it was basically this kind of light bulb moment for a lot of the areas that maybe were not easy to, work in day to day. And so I kind of said the same thing. Like, I think society as a whole wants some sort of pill, right? We're not always interested in doing the hard things, whether it's diet or exercise or, sleep or rest or stress management. We're always looking for, a pill to solve the problem. And so this is one where it's interesting where, it's not super complicated to make. We don't know all of the long-term effects to it, but it could have a lot of impact. When you think about all the healthcare issues that we have and the rising costs of it, obesity and some of the downstream effects of that are some of the causes of that. And so could this be something that is a moment like the air conditioner where people get on this? The stat today, I think, is almost 30% of the people in the United States are supposed to be are projected to be on this by 2030, and so that's not that long ago from now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think one thing that you talk about is a lot of these second and third order effects. Like the first order is weight loss and so on. What are some of those second and third order effects that you've observed, and how is the business world taking note?
Yeah, so I think there's ones that are kind of off-label. So maybe it's not about diabetes, but it's just about body inflammation. So I have a lot of Alzheimer's and dementia in my family, and so I've always been interested in that. And so you're starting to see doctors start to prescribe this almost in microdoses, just so that they're basically saying maybe we can reduce brain inflammation and put off these types of conditions. So those are kind of secondary things like that. The stats are things like grocery bills are going down by 6-7%. Alcohol consumption on people that are on GLPs is down like 30%. And so those are some of the second order effects that you're thinking about. I talked to somebody who is in the aviation industry, and they were saying, what happens if the average person that's flying, the average weight is down? What does that do to tickets? What does that do to fuel economy? There's all sorts of longer term things. You look at, Nabisco and Pepsi, AMC, all of these guys are starting to look at this and say, the way that I'm getting my money today is actually changing. And so what do I need to do if this demographic continues to go? They're not interested in going to a movie theater and buying the big box of popcorn, right? Because they just can't eat it. And so I think you're starting to think through all of these second and third order effects. And it's kind of interesting to think through.
So in the article, you talk about these organizations, like you mentioned Simon Property Group, for example, that I believe, and I could have this wrong, is making health businesses and wellness centers as kind of their flagship stores. When I was reading that, I was sort of I almost had this feeling of like a void. Like we went from just full impulse to immediately to gyms, and it feels like there's this kind of like this gap in the middle of inspiration over like what people need and what could fill that void. Does that make sense? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, maybe just tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking. I don't disagree with you, but like maybe just draw that out a little bit. Like what sort of steps do you think fit between those two? Because I agree with you. I mean, it's a big jump, but like people are already starting to think through, how is this changing my business? And then there's probably a lot of incremental steps between here and there.
Yeah, the short answer is I'm not sure yet, but it just feels like a kind of like rapid jump. It feels like that there needs to be a few middle steps. And if I thought about it a lot more, maybe I could come up with some examples. But it's like, yeah, what comes between I'm eating, a hot dog and a beer at a baseball game versus I'm going to spend this time going to the gym between innings or something. And I guess that's the big question. Yeah.
And I don't know if that's really going to happen. I mean, I think as society, we want the easy pill, right? We don't want to go do the hard work. And so I think, that's one of the things that's a downside to this. Once you're on it, in a lot of cases, they're saying you're on it for a long time, maybe the rest of your life, because if you get off of it and you don't change your behavior, you're going to gain that weight back. And then one of the other side effects that they're talking about is you can lose some muscle mass in this process. And so they're kind of recommending people to go on high protein diets and to do exercise and to maybe do more than you would have normally done. And so it'll be interesting to see. My personal belief is most of society doesn't want to do those hard things. I mean, and so we're looking for the shortcuts in a lot of this, and this is a way to do it. And so I think how this all plays out, I don't know, but I agree with you. Maybe the gyms at the baseball games probably not going to happen.
Yeah, who knows? To bring this to advertising, can you talk a little bit about some of those effects that you might have observed or that you might see coming down the pike for ads and clicks and all of that sort of thing, media?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at like Nabisco and kind of Pepsi in particular. I think they're already starting to look and say our lineup of salty, sweet snacks and stuff has got to change. And so if we're going to live with this demographic, and I think there's some other statistics out there that 137 million people could be on these things over the next 10 years. And so what does that do to those consumerization? It's going to change advertising behavior. It's going to, and I think the impulse control is what they're saying, right? So I'm not doing impulse controls on TikTok and Instagram to buy stuff. I'm not buying stuff last minute at the grocery store. I'm maybe buying less alcohol. And so I think new categories are going to have to come up to actually fill these voids. People have money and people like to spend. And so the question is, given this constraint, how do people's behaviors change and what changes in the way that they spend money? And I think lots of people are trying experiments today, like Pepsi. They're coming up with lines that are smaller packaging. Maybe they're more health conscious. And basically they're targeting people that want that maybe wanted the candy bar or something else that was a sweet snack.
So what you're saying makes sense, because what I imagine is that there is somewhat of this Pareto distribution where, the most impulsive people are accounting for a large amount of consumer revenue, right? Because like Facebook's probably funneling that traffic if you're optimizing for leads and that sort of thing. I guess my question is, like, you're working with startup founders that are probably thinking longer term than a lot of other business owners. Is this starting to, come into their calculus at all? And if so, how?
Probably not from most of them. I think, we're relatively short-sighted. I think you give us too much credit, actually, Dan. I think, they're really thinking about, like, what's my customer look like in 6 months? And so I got to go sell to that guy. So I've got a business and I can continue to go. They're all over the board. I mean, you got people that are selling to the civil engineering firms. You got people that are doing wildland fire. You got people, we do have some consumer stuff, but most of our stuff is B2B. So I would say in general, most of the startup founders that we talk to aren't really thinking about this today. I think like all of this is built on impulse control, right? If you're trying to do ads, you're trying to get people engaged to do a certain action. It doesn't really matter what you're selling. You're going to have to contend with some of this. And so, even sales cycles, you talk about a consumer play is really what you're kind of been talking about with TikTok or Facebook. But how does that even change, more of a corporate sale? Maybe that's already more procurement oriented and it's already got a set of stages. I just think there's a lot of unintended consequences that could happen through this process.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that, and I'm not sure, I think that we have this bias towards B2B being like less emotional, but it can absolutely be emotional. I just think there's more stakeholders involved, so that tends to kind of have this leveling effect. I guess where my head goes is it's like whenever there's more fear and anxiety, that can affect a B2B sale either positively or negatively. What's your knowledge, if any, about that or experience with how these drugs are affecting?
I don't really have a lot. I mean, I've spent my entire career for the most part in kind of B2B and a lot of it on the sales side of it. So far, there's been no literature that I could find that was really kind of influencing that. Like you said, I think there's more structure in how people do it because there's more stakeholders. But again, I think people buy because of relationships. They buy because of fear. They buy, there's a lot of intrinsic things that are the same as they are in a consumer impulse buy. It's just a bigger, more complex system that can have influence on that.
Right. And then at the end of the day, we're all downstream of consumer in some way or another. That's
correct.
right.
That's true.
So that makes a lot of sense. I guess some people might be incredulous about this and listening and be like, is this really going to affect, whatever 30% of people, 78 million Americans? How far along are we in this process? Is there a chance that there's some weird side effect that just throws all this stuff off course, or is it happening?
That's a good question, and I don't probably know the actual answer to it. I did talk to a guy, a PhD, MD doctor that prescribes these, and he was talking about the research that he did, and he said there's probably 22 to 24 years worth of data on these, and he felt pretty good. He's like, I see a lot of drugs that the pharmaceutical company puts in front of me that has a lot less track record than that. He's also told me, companies like, products like Mounjaro and stuff have done V1 and realized their side effects, and they've gone back to, figuring out how to get rid of the side effects and have a V2 relatively quickly. And so he said innovation in this space seems to be pretty high, but we're not going to know. Like, if you're on this for 50 years, what's the impact? We don't really know. I think he felt like that getting 30% of the population on it over time was not crazy. He's like, I have lots of people that are asking for it. It's starting off as a diabetes drug, but I have lots of people that don't have diabetes, but basically are asking for it, whether it's a weight loss issue, whether it's cardiovascular disease. And he goes, there's a lot of interest in it. Medicare doesn't cover it today. And so, that's a prohibitive issue. And I don't know if you followed this too, but there has been a shortage of these drugs. And so the compounding industry was filling that void. And so what they were essentially doing was building a specific compound for the individual and getting around some of the issues around, IP infringement. And now that there's more capability coming into the marketplace and there's not a shortage of these, they're shutting down a lot of these compounding organizations. So you see like Hims and some of these other ones that are kind of secondary markets that are advertising it. Those are all compounding. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens to that industry, because in theory, they're supposed to go away and use the commercially available drugs, but the price point just doesn't work for them.
Yeah, so it sounds like these drugs are going to be more accessible to more people, and
I think over time they're going to be. I think, basically there's going to be a demand for it. What's interesting to me, which I didn't really cover in the article, but is there an insurance company though that says this is actually a good deal for you? We'll pay for it, because the side effects or the cost of paying for this upfront versus the long-term care as you get into your later years, that calculus really works well. I'm sure there's some actuarial person that's basically doing the math as we speak and saying, if I pay for this upfront, even at these high costs, does it mitigate some of the downstream issues if you have, risk for cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, diabetes as you get older? And so I don't know. That's what the doctor was saying as well. He thought that was interesting, that he thought that there might be more propensity for insurance companies to look at this and cover it, because it's a short-term payment up front for long-term gain.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's probably good news for a lot of people that need to do something, even if there's there's downside risks. The course they're on, may not make the most sense. So one thing that I thought of as you were talking back to B2B is that I think it's turtles all the way down. It's like, it's all impulse control. Like, even if you're selling B2B, you're running LinkedIn ads, you're doing cold outreach, whatever, people are still needing, their impulses to click on things and to come into your world and that sort of thing. You mentioned in the article that the downstream effects of this could mean that like 50% of advertising strategies become obsolete. Whether that's 50 or 40 or 70, it doesn't matter. What do you think fills the void? Like, if you're thinking creatively and you're broad framing out a few years, like, what steps into the place of the old strategy?
I don't know. I don't think it actually does change the strategy. It's just different, right? I mean, it's like, there was a recent interview with Mark Zuckerberg, and he was talking about how their platform by the end of the year should be able to pick the persona that they want, the product you want to sell, will build the copy for you, and basically serve it up, right? And so that's a little freaky, but I think they have so much data that they think they can instrument that as quickly as you and I can for our expertise, for the audience and the persona that we try to sell to. And so I think that the buying process will just change, and what we have to in front of people will have to change. But it'll be an evolution of advertising just changes. It's still advertising, but like what resonates with people is probably going to change over time. And it's going to be an evolution is the way I kind of think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy way to think of it. And so much of this stuff is not unlike clothes or food or fashion, but we like to pretend that there's, this consistency that's not always there. So, Todd, this has been a lot of fun, man. Where can people go to find out what you're up to and follow your Substack and so on?
Yeah, so Todd Gagne on LinkedIn. There's a Wildfire Substack if you're interested in following that. Those are probably the two places to find me. I appreciate the time, Dan. It's been kind of a fun conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Appreciate it, man.